The story begins with a very wealthy man waking up in his mansion. His name is James King, and he's a popular hedge fund manager. James has developed a weird habit of getting out of bed butt naked and stretching out in front of his windows. As a result, his gardeners and other helpers around the house are forced to look at his nude body every morning. After putting on some clothes, James goes out to practice his martial arts with his trainer while two guys play the drums behind them. Despite making this training a routine, James still hasn't learned how to defend himself properly. At first glance, James has the perfect life. He's a wealthy hedge fund manager and is currently engaged to a beautiful lady named Alyssa, who also happens to be the daughter of his boss, Martin Barrow, the CEO of the company he works for. After getting ready, James drives to work. Meanwhile, elsewhere, we're introduced to another man named Darnell Lewis. That morning, Darnell calls some of his friends, asking for a loan so he can start up his business. When that doesn't work out, the guy desperately tells his daughter to ask some of her friends for money. Darnell's wife comes out to see her husband's pathetic antics and immediately gets pissed off. She takes the phone away and scolds him for it, explaining that he shouldn't be doing things to incur more debt. She then advises him to save up money instead. Darnell's wife encourages him and assures him that things would work out. Later, Darnell drops his daughter off at school, and afterward, he returns to his car wash business, which he set up in the parking lot of the same office James works in. Meanwhile, inside the building, James receives applause from the other workers for being an outstanding employee. Later that day, Martin Barrow, the owner of the company, calls James into his office and praises him for his incredible contributions to the company. James had successfully made $28 million for the company, and Martin was very impressed. So much so that he even tells James to start calling him father since he and Alyssa would be getting married soon. Hearing this, James is so touched that he embraces Martin and even sheds tears. After work, James gets into his car, preparing to go back home when Darnell pops up at his window. James is startled when he sees Darnell at his window, feeling that he wanted to mug him. However, Darnell just tells him that he wants to return his keys. It turns out that James washes his car at Darnell's car wash every day. Darnell decides to seize the opportunity and asks James to invest in his car wash business with $30,000. Unfortunately, James tells him that he isn't interested and drives off shortly after. Later that evening, James and Alyssa hold their engagement party. At the party, Alyssa presents an electric guitar to James as a gift in front of the guests. Alyssa also invites James's favorite musician to perform at the party, but just when everyone is dancing to the music, a group of FBI agents storm the place to arrest James on charges of fraud and embezzlement. As the agents restrain James and forcefully take him away, he appears perplexed, trying to explain that he didn't do anything illegal to make his money. Despite the protests, he's taken away by them. The following day, Martin arrives with a lawyer named Peter Penny to handle James's case. For some reason, Peter doesn't believe that James is innocent and suggests that he plead guilty, because if he does, the trial would be faster and he'll be sentenced for only a year. James gets upset when he hears this and insists that he's innocent. He refuses to plead guilty, believing that he would be exonerated. Afterward, James is taken away by the FBI and the clients of the company, who felt they've been exploited, protested, and clamored for James to be locked up. The day of the trial arrives and James is found guilty because he refused to admit that he was. The judge sentences him to 10 years in the toughest prison in the country, the San Quentin State Prison. However, before James would serve the prison sentence, the judge gives him 30 days to sort out all his files and get his things in order. Until the 30 days are over, James becomes a city prisoner, and a tracking device is strapped to his ankle so he doesn't escape. For the next 5 days, James lives a miserable life, waiting for the day he's locked away. Until he comes up with an idea. He decides to cut off the tracking device on his ankle and grabs some of his savings at home. He then disguises himself and meets Alyssa at a restaurant where he tells her his plan to flee the country with her. Unfortunately, she turns him down and breaks up with him because she doesn't want to live in poverty with him abroad. Afterward, the police arrive and arrest James again. Realizing that he can't escape from the city, James decides to meet Darnell at the car wash. He tells Darnell about his current dilemma and assumes that he served in prison before because of his background. James confesses that he's terrified of going to prison, so he asks Darnell to get him ready for it. Despite being slightly offended by James' racist comment, Darnell agrees to help, but only if he's willing to pay $30,000. James immediately accepts the deal, and when Darnell returns home, he tells his wife about it. She gets upset that he resorted to scamming people for money and further points out that he probably won't be able to get James ready for prison because he'd never done time before. Regardless, Darnell is unfazed and decides to call his cousin who had been to jail in the past. The guy tells him about all of his experiences in prison, and after taking notes, Darnell feels prepared to train James. The following day, Darnell goes to James's house to begin the training. He asks him if he's ever practiced self-defense, and he responds by changing into his martial arts uniform before performing some pathetic and ineffective moves. Darnell immediately tells him that his moves are useless, and concludes that James can't defend himself. A few days later, Darnell transforms James' house into a makeshift prison to get him familiar with the experience. With 21 days left before James' appeal trial, he calls Martin to ask about the information, and during the call, he hears Darnell's voice and asks about him. When James explains their arrangement, Martin appears a bit scared. After the call, it is revealed that Martin was the one who framed James for the crime, simply because he didn't approve of his relationship with his daughter, Alyssa. Martin then instructs some of his men to keep tabs on Darnell so that he doesn't interfere with his plans. James continues his training and journey to become tougher, but despite all of his efforts, he realizes that he's not cut out for the tough life. He tries to escape from his makeshift prison, but that doesn't work out either. Soon, James only had 10 days left before the trial, and by some miracle, James had gotten harder. Darnell is impressed when he sees James sharpening a knife that he made himself and decides to give him one final test to prove that he's ready for life in prison. For the final test, Darnell must escape from the home prison during a riot that would be made by the workers in James's home. Unfortunately, James fails the test woefully, and even worse, he gets a knife stuck in his head. Without wasting any time, Darnell rushes him to his house, where his wife, who's a nurse, treats the wound. Afterward, Darnell's wife invites James to have dinner with them, but is shocked when she sees him gobbling down the food like an animal. After he leaves, she tells Darnell that she doesn't think James can survive in prison with his current behavior, which makes Darnell begin to doubt that the training would work. The next day, Darnell takes James to his cousin, Russell, who'd been in prison before. He asks Russell to contact some of his friends who are still in jail and ask them to protect James. However, Russell points out that all his friends in jail are black and wouldn't want to protect a white guy like James. Russell suggests that they meet the white gang and ask for help. Later that night, James and Darnell go to the white gang's base, but when James goes in alone to ask for help, they assume that he's an undercover cop and decide to torture him. Thankfully, Darnell realizes that James is in trouble, so he causes an explosion to distract them, allowing him and James to escape. Afterward, Darnell and James talk about the situation, and he helps James realize that the only person to be suspected of fraud. However, James finds it hard to believe that his future father-in-law would set him up. As a result, Darnell suggests that they sneak into his office and check the computer with all of the records. The following day, they dress up as janitors and steal the computer with incriminating evidence. However, Martin's bodyguard intercepts them, and in the ensuing struggle, Darnell grabs his gun and points it at the bodyguard. Unfortunately, since he'd never even held a gun, his hands are shaking and the bodyguard senses it, so he snatches the gun from him and retrieves the computer. After the incident, James realizes that Darnell has been lying to him about going to prison, so he leaves in anger. The next day, James joins Russell's gang so that he can commit a crime so tough that the other inmates would be afraid of him. Russell asks him to join the gang to rob a gang, but just when he's about to get ahead with it, Darnell arrives. He apologizes for deceiving him but assures him that they can still take Martin down. With 20 hours left before James is picked up by the authorities, Darnell reveals that whenever he washed Martin's car, the tires always had beach sand on them. On that note, he concludes that Martin must be hiding the computer on his yacht. They then sneak on the boat and manage to find the computer, but once again, they're intercepted by the bodyguards. When one of the men mocks James and Darnell for being weak, something sparks in James, and he suddenly begins fighting like a pro, beating all the men with Darnell's help. Unfortunately, just when they're about to escape, Martin and Alyssa find them. Martin then asks one of his men to threaten them with a gun, but James suddenly remembers that Russell gave him a gun earlier. He decides to stall them till the police come, knowing that the alarm on his tracker would have gone off because he'd crossed the city border. Eventually, the police arrive, and after going through the evidence, Martin and his men are arrested. All embezzlement charges on James are also dropped, but unfortunately, James is seen holding the gun, and is also arrested for possession of illegal firearms. However, before serving his 6-month sentence, he invests in Darnell's car wash business. Thanks to the previous training and experience, James is also able to survive in jail and stand up to the inmates who try to bully him. Meanwhile, Darnell's car wash business starts booming, and he begins to make a lot of money. Darnell visits him in prison from time to time, and by the time the sentence is over, the two have become very good friends, and Darnell even comes to pick James up the day he's set free. That's all for today's recap. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.